Hey everyone, welcome to Local Energy. This week we have a special episode with Chris Hedge. I met Chris on LinkedIn. He's a prolific writer in the oil and gas space, writes about energy markets, has a history with Chevron and a number of other large oil companies. And we just dive into some timely topics about Venezuela, Sable Offshore, and his 2026 outlook for the oil and gas market. So enjoy this special episode of Local Energy, and we'll see you again on Friday for our typical release. Thanks. All right, welcome to Local Energy. My name is Peter Brecht. Wade is not with us today, but we have special guest Chris Hedge with us today. We're going to be going through some interesting topics. He's been writing on LinkedIn, been following for some time, and just excited to have this conversation. So, Chris, thanks for joining. How are you doing today?
Peter, thanks for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. And I'm in Houston, so it's a cold, blustery winter day here. So I've got
Yeah.
a parka on with my flip flops. So
Exactly. Yeah. I read this morning there's a big wind ripping through the Permian right now, but you're well south of that. So
no, I'm in the southern piney woods,
yeah,
man. There's
yeah.
no wind here.
You're in the good place. Well, Chris, I've been so I followed you on LinkedIn a couple months ago. I read one of your articles top to bottom, and then LinkedIn just decided to keep serving me articles that you were writing. And it turns out you're a pretty prolific writer on there. You're following a lot of key topics in oil and gas and energy and just across the board. And so just thankful to have you on. I wanted to take today's conversation and maybe kind of set up what you would think of as like a 2026 outlook, things that you're looking at. And you've written about this quite a bit as well. Maybe we could talk about Venezuela, Sable Offshore, and then a couple other things that you're into. But before we get into that, give us a little background on yourself and what you're up to these days.
Oh my gosh! So how much time do you have? Yeah. So we talked a little bit about this, but my professional career was I worked for Chevron for 30 years. Started in California, moved to Houston, never wanted to really go back. I was actually hired into Chevron in the IT realm. I was a programmer when I first started with them. Spent 10 years doing that, was IT manager for the pipeline company, which was my entree into that other side of the business. Because then I got my MBA, moved over, and was doing commercial planning strategy work for the pipeline company. And around the early 2000s, when Enron imploded, they took Dynegy with them. Dynegy was Chevron's. I know it's a long story. Dynegy was
No, it's
Chevron's
great.
oil or gas and NGL company. Right. It came out of the ground, immediately went over to them. And when they imploded, those contracts went, the gas contracts were up for renegotiation. So we went through a process of taking those gas contracts back in-house, building a gas business. You see all their activities around gas this day. And about a year later, the NGL contracts came up. Targa had them, and we elected not to renew, bring it in-house. And I spent a number of years building out the trading function, in doing what I could to help set up the trading function in Singapore, London, and Houston. I mean, Chevron really didn't have a trading function in those spaces. So it was really trying to build that out. Texaco did. So it was about the time of the Texaco merger. We got a lot of expertise from Texaco in this space. And when we bought Texaco, we also got Caltex, which is the Asian joint venture of the two. Evidently, all of a sudden, I'm the NGL expert. And I spent a lot of time running around Asia evaluating some Caltex, hesitate to call them investments, but projects or businesses, and
Mhm.
trying to figure out why they were losing so much money and give them either a turnaround plan or a recommendation to divest, right? So
Okay.
Caltex, love those guys, but they like to do projects. Didn't care if the projects made money, they just like to do projects. And it was a
Yeah.
lot of fun working with those guys. So then after
Yeah.
that, I was on the trading floor for a while, working with the traders in the upstream, trying to bridge that gap. I know it's a long story. And then the last 10 years of my career there, I ran their long range analytics team. So we came up with basically the price deck,
Hmm.
and we did investment analysis, for the Chevron executives and the board, and also for the Chevron
Yeah.
board members for Chevron Phillips Chemical Company, right? So when they put
Yeah.
forth a project to do the first cracker, it came through my shop for vetting, right? And we took a look at that, ran our assumptions through it, and kind of gave the executives the nod, or told them what questions to ask or what to get changed or whatever.
That's awesome.
And then,
A lot of data.
so honestly, I'd still be at Chevron today, except for they decided to combine the downstream group that I was leading with the corporate group in California, and they said we want it based in San Ramon. And I'm like, I've got kids. They're entrenched. My wife, she's a lawyer. She has her own career. I can't move. So, we parted ways. I worked for ICIS for a while on the chemical side. I worked for a consultancy with a bunch of buddies of mine doing value chain optimization. And then I landed for the last 6 years at WoodMac, running their oils, basically the liquid side of the business, and then focusing on NGLs and chemicals there towards the end. And they decided to focus their concentrated efforts in all of the energy transition, gas, power, and we're kind of letting, not to bash them, right? It's just a business decision,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
they were not really investing in the liquid side of their business. So, we parted ways, and now I'm kind of doing some consulting on the side and a lot of writing. I'm an intellectually curious kind of guy. My background obviously is oil and gas, but I also
Yeah.
have that IT background, so you'll see a lot of stuff on, technology and some other things. And then the oil connection to geopolitics, right? So you've seen a couple of articles about Venezuela. I think I even put one out there about why Greenland is so important to the U.S.
Haven't
So,
read that one
what
yet.
I really write about what I find curious.
Hey guys, thanks for listening to this week's episode of Local Energy. Please remember to like and subscribe to us here on YouTube or Spotify, or check us out at localenergy.com. All right, back to the show. Yeah, that's awesome. I mean, there's I might have been you that I was talking with, but writing is kind of my way of thinking through problems too, right? So as you put pen
Exactly,
to
right?
paper, you sort of start to draft things out and realize maybe you don't think what you thought you thought. It's kind of an interesting way to think through things. But I like reading what you got now. Venezuela, I know, or if you don't mind digging into this one with me, but I'm just curious. Like, I'll be honest, it's hard for me to follow the news on it because it's hard to get facts. And I know even if you say this is a fact, people are going to be like, no, that's not correct. And there's all these things. But I guess in talking to, and since we're here, like, what's your take on the subject, or like what are maybe people not talking about that we should know? Because my understanding is that we were down in Venezuela, we're doing the oil and gas thing, and then we got kicked out. So had to leave all this stuff behind. American companies lost a lot of stuff that they were supposed to be able to just keep going. So I don't know. Help me put this together. There's just a lot of broken pieces that I don't really have wrapped in my head.
Well, I mean, that's the history, right? Everybody got
Yeah.
pretty much kicked out except for Chevron. Chevron was there. They made some sacrifices, took junior positions in their joint ventures, right? I mean, I'm not saying they didn't lose, but they always kept a foot on the ground,
Yeah.
right? I mean, they even had some of their executives thrown in jail while I was with Chevron, right? And that was a big issue. But really, it's yes, Venezuela is a huge resource-rich nation that's obviously it's been abused and whatever by their own government, but the intervention there is not necessarily about oil specifically, right? Not the way people think, right? Nobody's going in, the US isn't going in and taking that oil for our own use or for our own benefit, right? This is more of a geopolitical play. It gets into politics.
Hmm.
And if you don't think there's a Cold War going on between us, Russia, and China, you're sadly mistaken, right?
Okay.
So I think it's an oil play, but it's more denial, right? Right. Where we can go in and we can more control the access to it.
Okay.
And you see that the way that they've set this up. And there's been a lot of complaints that Trump is stealing the money, but I honestly don't believe that. And I hope and pray it gets funneled back into the country itself because it's
Hmm.
it's it's a mess.
Okay.
But
Gotcha.
it's not a oil, we're not stealing anybody's oil, right? I mean, you
Right.
can look at it any way you want, but at the end of the day, the money should be funneled back into them to get them back up on their feet.
Hmm.
I think if we'd have wanted to, and again, this is politics, if we'd have wanted to take the oil, it would have been a much more full scale issue, right? I think
Okay.
it was more posturing.
Hmm.
There's been talk about, the Chinese and the Russians are trying to get a foothold in the
Hmm.
country, right? So there were some agreements for some military bases.
Yeah.
I think there's been talk with Cuba along the same things. And this was a statement by the administration that we're not going to allow it, right?
Okay. Yeah. Absolutely.
And to a certain degree, I think Greenland's a lot of the same thing, right? I mean,
Yeah.
I think it was, were we going to invade Greenland? Yeah, I don't think so. I think it was more, this is my opinion, strictly my
Yeah. Yeah.
opinion,
Right. Right.
that quite frankly, I think the U.S. saw a need to beef up security around Greenland, and they wanted to do a buildup. Could they've gone in and negotiated treaty? We already have treaties with Denmark, who owns it, right? So we probably could have done just about anything we wanted. I think he just didn't want to spend money, and the big issue was to get Europe to do it. So it was a hold
Sure.
my beer moment, right? We're going to threaten
Yeah.
to invade
Yeah.
because he's known for his bluster and his BS.
Yeah. Yeah.
They sent 30 guys in to start an investigation of how they could beef up Greenland security. I mean, was it negotiated and planned? Because there's always a public view with him and there's a
Right.
private view, and sometimes they
Hmm.
cross. But I mean, I'm not
Yeah.
the biggest Trump fan,
Yeah.
but there's always something going on in the background that the public is not
Sure.
aware of, right? And that's always, I find it intellectually curious to try and figure out what that is.
I agree, and I'm kind of the same mindset. It's like, I'm not a politically inclined human. I believe it or not. It's like I can't. I don't know what's right or wrong, and that's why it's good to just have these discussions. But then going back to Venezuela, you look at WTI and kind of the outlook. I mean, when Venezuela happened, WTI started going down, and everyone's like, "Well, we're going to have all this oil," and I think there's a big misunderstanding. I personally don't think that Venezuela is going to have a massive impact on our reserves. And I might be very well off on that statement, but I mean, I think that the US oil and gas economy is going to do fairly well throughout the rest of the year. And I don't know, maybe you have a different opinion, but I'd kind of like to hear your thoughts on how Venezuela would affect our market
I don't think
potentially.
Venezuela is going to affect anything in 2026, right? They may be
Okay.
able to ramp up production a little bit, but
Yeah.
it's, again, it's heavy crude. And if they do that, what'll happen is the light heavy differential will need to fall significantly
Okay.
before the US refiners start to take that, right? We're not back in the day where they want to optimize their asset 100%. They don't play that anymore. They optimize
Hmm.
margin.
Okay.
So they need that differential in order to fire up those cokers and heavy conversion units, right? I mean, everybody
Interesting.
like to see them running, but we've adjusted to a light tight oil situation where, that's why we're still importing heavy crude, right? Because we can't get enough of the products out of the oil that we produce to
Okay.
feed the world, right? So, I mean,
Okay.
there's a reason why they do that. And it's a little bit of optimizing my assets, right? And trying to
Hmm.
keep my conversion units running and whatnot. But again, they're optimizing on margin, not necessarily on utilization of the unit. But
Okay.
you got to, you go back to the 90s. I'm old. I know I'm old. And you got to remember that the prevailing view was that was the future, right? We're
Hmm.
running out of light oil. The North fields were in decline. We were going to see a lot of WTI. The Permian was in decline. Everybody was in decline, and except for
Hmm.
this heavy crude. There's Canadian tar sands. There was all this South American heavy Mexican Maya, right? And that was
Hmm.
the belief. So they invested billions in the Gulf Coast refining system to be able to
Yeah.
process this stuff,
Okay.
right? And that's kind of how we got into that. And then all of a sudden, light tight comes on,
Hmm.
and there's not enough distillation capacity in the U.S. to run it all,
Hmm.
right? So you saw the ban on exports get lifted. Now we can export it to the rest of the world and fill up their distillation columns before
Okay.
they get their back end units. Right. So the whole world is kind of adjusted to this. And we've got Canadian heavy crude coming into the Gulf Coast that kind of makes up the difference. But again, it keeps those units running to where they need to.
Hmm.
But for them to start switching again, they need to see that light heavy differential really widen out and make it profitable to do so.
Hmm.
Does that mean that Venezuelan crude won't still go to China? No, I mean, but they control it and they can cut it off if they need to.
How much do I read that the lifting costs in Venezuela were like $30 or $35 a barrel, and I don't supposedly that's high and maybe makes it almost like not economic, but is that something that plays a factor or not really?
Well, what's driving the lifting costs, right? I mean, if it's crude, so what they've done is that they've been using floating storage, right, for what they couldn't export. So there's a lot of already loaded or in storage crude. So what's driving the lifting costs? Well, a lot of it's going to be about insurance,
Got it.
right? And
Yeah.
insuring those vessels that somebody doesn't decide to take out an illegal cargo, right? I mean, you
Right.
hear all
Yeah.
this
Yeah.
about China's shadow fleet and Russia's
Mhm.
shadow fleet, right? Turn off the AIS, go do
Yeah.
what you
Yeah.
got to do, and then turn it back on. So you really got to look at what's driving those high lifting costs, and it's
Yeah.
it's around the shipping aspect, right? Because
Okay.
if the facilities are there to load and the oil is sitting there, yeah, they probably got to, if it's heavy viscous crude, they've got to heat it a little bit to get it on the ship or whatever, right? They've used diluent to get it down to where they can pump it. So what's driving the
Okay.
cost? What's the ships,
Okay.
right?
Gotcha. Interesting.
The freight costs have gone up dramatically for those types of
Yeah.
loadings.
Yeah, and I know the insurance side of it, that's just not even a fun
That's your
topic,
game,
but
right?
it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate that that's like, okay, if insurance comes up as a negative, that's not a good thing. Anyways, pivoting over into, a conversation. So we actually had an interview yesterday, and that'll be released in a couple of weeks. So well after this has gone out, but conversation turned over to, Shale. So we've got Permian doing P&A on, and how we've only maybe gotten 2 to 5% of really what of the reserves out of the shale. Now, do you think that there's another shale play that's going to happen, and we're going to get back into that, or have you anything on that? Maybe that's not your wheelhouse, but just curious if you have any thoughts on it.
A lot of what it comes down to is, because we're into the source rock, right? Do we know the extent of the source rock? I mean, the geology is fairly well defined.
Mhm.
The question is the technology comparable with the geology, right?
Okay.
Because not only in the U.S., I
Yeah.
mean, in the U.S. is where it's centered, right? But there's a lot of shale throughout the world, right? There's just a lot of issues with recovering those shales, right? The geology in China, like the geology doesn't work really well.
Okay.
In Europe, it's the issue with surface permits, to be perfectly honest with you, right? There's a lot of history in Europe. So you get an acre of farmland and it could be owned by 200 different descendants of the original owner, and they all
Man.
have their 10-foot by 10-foot plot, right?
Mhm.
And you have to get a surface lease from every single one of them and running them. So it's a logistics nightmare. Plus,
Yeah.
the big drillers, the big Barcos and the rest of those guys, they aren't there.
Right.
Right. So there's just a lot of challenge. It's there. You can probably recover it. It's just there's a lot of
Hmm.
challenges before you
Right.
even get to the politics of it. Right. And I
Right.
know that, again, back when I was at Chevron, we had a couple of test wells, and that's how I learned all of this stuff. It's just
Okay.
you think, there's no big landowners in there, right? They're not. It's like
Hmm.
everybody owns a 10-foot by 10-foot plot. And if you're going to put a
Yeah.
road in or you're going to drill, I mean, you got surface rights, you still need the mineral rights. And
Hmm.
it's just a nightmare to do business in.
Got it. So
And
don't
plus you
be a
have to
landman
build
in
out the
Europe.
infrastructure because it ain't there.
Yeah, yeah, I gotcha. But Texas, I mean, I mean, that's a little easier, I'd imagine. And if we're focusing on, the US stuff, it's possible that we could go back in 5 or 10 years with better data and,
Well,
on that
better
side and
technology, right? I think it's more
okay,
like better technology, right? Because
okay,
again, the geology will tend to work against you,
okay,
right? And
okay,
Mitchell played around with this for years before he discovered the formula, right, to unlock the
yeah,
Haynesville.
right,
But once he did, you saw it's like the computer age, right? It's just the advances in technology just come
right.
faster and faster and faster and faster as people.
Hmm.
I mean, you see it now. The lateral lengths are outrageously long, right?
Yeah,
The
they are.
well
Yeah,
efficiencies are outrageously long. Decline rates are still crappy, right? But
yeah,
the technology is getting better, and we haven't even started in on refracking a lot of this stuff, right? Because if you
right.
think about it, fracking is going in and using basically pressure to crack the source rock to pull the molecules or to let the molecules flow out. But
Hmm.
over time, the source rock will tend to clog back up, and that's why you get this big decline rate, and then you get into more of a steady state. So you can go back and refract that, which means really bust it back open again, and you get back like 70% of your IP rate, but then you get that decline.
Yeah,
But we haven't seen whole scale refracking going on in the Permian, right? Because they're still laying new wells, they're still clearing their ducts. So to me, it's not a new shale formation will be discovered. I think they'll have
hmm,
technologies to come in and work over and increase the efficiency of the existing wells. But
okay,
that said, I'm not
yeah,
a subsurface guy, right?
yeah, yeah.
This is strictly my opinion and what I think based on
But
my limited knowledge.
no, and it's good, and I like the way that you frame things and the questions you're asking, or maybe I think that maybe because it's not something that you're in every day, you might be asking questions different, which I think is that's why we're here, right? I like hearing different
Well, I don't know what
perspectives.
I
So
don't know, right? So I do ask a lot
yeah,
of stupid questions. And I always say there's no such thing as a stupid question except question you
yeah,
didn't ask, right?
exactly. Yeah.
So
Yep. Uh, Flipping over now, we're gonna move over to the West Coast. This was something in the pregame that we were talking about. I got to talk about Sable. I'm California born and raised. My wife's a surfer. I can't leave. I'm here trying to make the most of what I can with the California oil and gas community. But Sable's obviously been a very big topic here, and just across local communities talking about it. Now we have the Fed coming in, and it's like so. I would love to just hear your perspective on it and just overall your thoughts about Sable.
well, it's not Sable necessarily. It's the fact that they're trying to restart those fields offshore Santa Barbara. Gutsy move,
Yeah,
right? I
yeah,
mean,
absolutely.
again, back in Chevron used to own and operate those fields, and I mean, I can tell
Yeah.
you horror stories of, issues, and mostly around
Hmm.
permitting. And that seems to be what their issue is as well, right? And it is just the environment in California. I'll tell a story. I'll try not to
Yeah.
name too many names, right? But
It's all right.
the method
Yeah.
is okay, we're going to require you to do inspections, and we're going to require you to do maintenance. And if you don't do the inspections, we're going to fine you. If you don't do the maintenance that's found by the inspections, we're going to fine you. But in order to do the inspections and or the maintenance, you need a permit. We're not going to grant you the permit because you're oil and gas, right? So
Yeah.
that's a money scheme right there. And then, okay, and then there's an incident. And then they're going to come in and fine you because you didn't do the maintenance that you knew about, right? To keep the incident from happening. So it's a nightmare place to do business. Now, can you grease the skids a little bit? Oh yeah, you can do, I forget what we used to call it, but you can do community improvement projects. And if you do enough of them to the right tune for certain cities, they'll grant you a permit, right? I mean, and they're not small dollar things, right? These are not build a park.
Sure.
These are 90, $100 million just to get a freaking permit.
Yeah.
To do something
Amazing.
that they require you to do anyway, right? I mean, that's just the regulatory environment there. And again, we're offshore Santa Barbara. If you've been to Santa Barbara, if you haven't been to Santa Barbara, go. It's amazing, right?
It is, yeah. It's beautiful.
Great wines too. It's the hidden gem of wine country. And basically they don't want to sit there and have this beautiful ocean view and see oil rigs off in the distance.
Right. Yeah.
They love it. They just don't want it in their backyard.
It's funny. I mean, to me, that's a beautiful sight. Most people, I guess, they just don't like it. It's a different opinion, but yeah.
Well, if you have a $50 million house sitting on the cliffs with that beautiful view, you see it in some of the shows where it's like it's just an amazing thing. And if you pay that kind of money, you don't want half your money's in the view, right? That's where the value comes from.
Yeah.
So it's like anywhere else. You can do whatever you want. Just don't bring my property values down.
Right. But then there's the whole thing where they're like, well, we'll just, instead of having the rigs, let's just go and put 100 windmills like that. I think that's just as bad. So,
they'd fight that too. They would not off Santa Barbara. Oh yeah.
Yeah. Santa Barbara.
Do you see any, let me put it this way. Do you see any windmills offshore?
Yeah, no. Yeah. For a reason. Yeah.
No. They'll put them in San Joaquin Valley, right? They got a nice breeze going through there. That should be pretty successful, but don't put them in my $50 million view, right? They just won't see it. And then if they, so they can't really control the offshore stuff because I'm not sure if the field's in state waters or out of state waters. I don't remember. But where they get you is trying to bring it on shore.
Okay. Yeah.
Right. I mean, Chevron had a pipeline that came in and had to cross Highway 1, went under Highway 1. And anytime you had to do anything to that pipeline, it was just a nightmare because it crossed Highway 1.
Okay.
It's scenic highway. You're not touching our scenic highway. Don't shut it down.
Yeah. Right.
Don't take it offline. Don't create a traffic jam. Don't do anything. So I even think honestly, since Chevron had I can't say we anymore. Since Chevron had that right away, we were being approached by fiber optics companies to utilize our right-of-way to run fiber optic on shore, right? Because they're running the long lines in across the Pacific. And they were trying to make a deal with Chevron to utilize that easement that we had under Highway 1 to get their fiber optics on shore for communications. I don't know why the state of California was fighting that either, but they didn't want to give anybody an easement across Highway 1.
Well, I'm rooting for Sable. I mean, I hope that they come through on it. I mean, he spent a lot of money. They spent a lot of money for it, right? And I think that they're doing what they can.
But what's their end game, right? What's their end game? So they bring it on shore. What are they going to do with it? Who's going to process it? If all the refineries are shutting down.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. That's a good point.
I mean, are they gonna load it onto ships and take it elsewhere?
That's a good question. Yeah, I mean, they're shutting down 2. Well, I think they're already in process of being shut down, but 2 recently. So that's going to be I don't know. It's going to be an interesting. I'll be going to SIPA this year. It'll be an interesting room to hang out in and see how it's going. So
I mean, Chevron moved their headquarters out. Chevron's moving their headquarters out of California to Houston, which I didn't think they'd ever do because of the 2 refineries, right? And they have production in the San Joaquin Valley, and they have the KLMR pipeline that runs up. I didn't think they'd ever do it, but
I really, you're right. It's something I didn't think about. I mean, all this stuff kind of goes hand in hand, and it'll be an interesting story to watch through the rest of the next couple of months. I don't know how much longer they're gonna be able to keep going. I know a couple engineers that are working actually on the platforms, and I mean they're busy as they could be. but again, like, what is the end game? That's a great question. So
But if they can't get the permit for the pipe,
yeah,
why don't they just look at, doing offshore loading and just take it, basically right out of the ground, and then they'll just do, they'll have some big moorings, and they can load
yep,
the ships
yeah,
right offshore if they can find the vessels for it, right? Because again, if they try to bring it onshore, that the problem is the Jones Act, right? They need U.S. based shipping, and there's not enough of it, so that means they got to take it somewhere else if they want to get around the Jones Act.
totally understand. So this is the last topic we'll get into, and I like personally, I want to have you on next year so we can look back at this one and say, where did everything end up, and like where are we at, kind of like a cool snapshot. I just enjoyed talking with you, but if you were going to look at 2026, like, do you have a couple predictions or thoughts on that? And then we'll move to wrap up after that. But I'm just curious what your outlook would be for the year ahead with oil and gas, or any other topics. If you have a sports team and all that stuff, it's fine.
I'm going to separate oil from gas, right? Because
Okay.
I
Okay.
think, gas with the LNG facilities coming online. Now there's a limit, but I think, we're going to see, nice prices for gas just because, there's the demand for it, and we have a way of getting it out to the limit of the LNG facilities, right? I think there's more demand than we can build LNG facilities or liquefaction facilities to get it out. So I'm kind of really pro gas, right? I think we're going to see a lot more gas drilling. Oil has been, over the last several years, has been in the U.S. is we've been underinvesting, right? And yet, I say that, and everybody, the first thing they go is, well, their production's going up. Well, yes, but that's more through efficiencies, clearing ducts, and for other things, right? Rig counts are down for the most part on average, and we've
Mhm.
just been underinvesting in production, and that will catch up with us, which in the end it will catch up with us. But for currently, right, we're seeing prices lower for a lot of reasons, right? Venezuela being one of them. There's more oil coming onto the market, but not that fast. It's that we've dramatically underestimated the effects on demand, right? So you get into that
Yeah.
energy transition, and demand isn't growing at the rate that it used to. So we're underinvesting. I think we'll see lower prices, kind of
Hmm.
probably around the $50 ish through this year until the surplus is eaten up through increase, natural growth and demand. And then what's going to happen is going to swing the other way. We're going to start to see prices go up,
Okay.
right, as that
Yeah.
production problem comes into effect. And it's not like the old days where they're just in drill baby drill, right? They're being very disciplined with their capital investment. The market has to be there. They'll
Hmm.
look to efficiencies to increase production, but you got to remember the US decline rate's like 5 million barrels a day per year,
Hmm.
right? So how
Okay.
fast, and that's how much they have to reproduce in order to
Right.
offset the declines and just stay where they're at, which is a lot, quite frankly, right? So there's still a
Yeah.
lot of investment, a lot of efficiencies, but we're not growing production intentionally. It's growing through more of an efficiency type of issue.
Okay.
So I think that'll catch up with us, but I don't think it'll catch up with us in 2026. I think it'll take a little bit longer, depending on what's going on in the rest of the world, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Short of
Yeah.
somebody blowing up something, or
Yeah.
Middle Eastern
Black Swan
conflict,
event. Yeah.
something. Yeah, well, something happening in the Middle East, right? It's a volatile
Yeah.
region.
Yeah.
So short of something like that, or OPEC deciding, they're going to put a lot of the cuts back on to dramatically decrease supply to prop up price, right?
Yeah.
So short of that, I think we should see moderate oil prices, which is great at the pump, but probably below the sweet spot for investment until that increases in demand kind of offset the surplus that we're looking at.
Gotcha. Well, that's a great outlook. Is there anyone that we should be following or looking at or reading that maybe you look at in the space, just as other resources, or anyone that you enjoy listening to or talking with?
Not off the top of my, I mean, like I said, I'm kind of intellectually curious, and I kind of go where my
Yeah.
curiosity takes me. But I mean,
Yeah.
there are some certain things that I keep on top of, right? I mean, OPEC meets fairly recently or fairly frequently,
Hmm.
and I try to keep up with what they're thinking, even though sometimes, what they say is not necessarily what's really going on. So trying to understand that. The bigger picture, geopolitics, because that'll obviously, if there's a conflict somewhere, that will affect oil prices, and trying to anticipate that. And then just looking at, how production and demand are evolving over time.
Okay.
And I've got
Yeah.
that's a huge value chain, right? From oil, gas, NGLs is a whole nother area that we didn't talk about. And then chemicals also is a whole nother area, but they're all interconnected. And then you look at the next wave as well, what's going on in minerals and mining, what's going on in battery tech, because, and it's all around this energy transition.
Hmm.
The energy transition is going to help. It's not driven by climate change. It's driven by necessity that oil and gas is a finite resource. And unless we come up with some sort of carbon recycling method, we're going to need to transition, right? It's
Yeah.
really what climate change is all about, is accelerating the transition. And there's
Okay.
a whole slew of issues that we could talk about that go around behind that, right?
Yeah.
But though, I mean, those are just kind of the topics I try. If you look at my automated Google searches, these are the topics that I look for. And every morning I come in here and I have 10 emails that say, here's the summary of those
Hmm.
topics that you searched on, and I can go through them pretty quickly and then follow up. And if there's something that really captures my attention or something, I'll dig into it and write something.
Love it. Well, Chris, thank you for coming on and talking with
No,
us.
thanks for having me.
I'm gonna put a link to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes. If you want to follow up and kind of keep in touch, that's probably the best way. Is there anywhere else that you are socially active on the internet
No,
that people should know
it's
about?
primarily LinkedIn, because I like to,
Okay.
you get on some of these other places and it devolves into
Yeah.
political discourse. And I would rather do it here, because the comments I get here, yeah, you get a couple of the wild ones, but for the most part they're
Yeah.
thoughtful,
Right.
right? And people have thought about it, and and it's fine. Disagree with me all you want, right? I like that. I like to know, well, what am I missing, right? What am I not seeing? What did I not find? So if you know
Yeah.
something that I don't,
Yeah.
but it's just more of a professional environment. And,
Yeah.
I really appreciate all the comments that people feedback. And if you read the articles, tell me what you think, right? Because again, there's no rhyme or reason to it. It's all whatever happens to interest me that day. And, I
Yeah.
may look into something and it may spawn 3 articles, right?
There you go. Yeah. The content keeps coming. Well, thank you for coming on. To
No, I
all of our
appreciate it.
listeners. Yeah. To all of our listeners, thank you for joining us on this special episode. And we'll see you guys again here soon in a couple days. All right. Thanks. All right.